Hey everyone, we have a very special guest with us today. We have Desi Ugarte, who is a digital marketer with 8 years of experience in the field. She has a diverse background in content marketing, having worked in the NGO sector and founded a successful slow fashion marketplace in Guatemala. In the past 3 years, Desi has specialized in content marketing for developers and has worked for tech open source startups such as Med USA, Strappy, and currently AppSmith. It's wonderful to have you here, Dizzy. Thank you for taking the time to chatting with me.
No, thank you for the invite. I'm excited about this.
Super. Without further ado, we can get started. So
Yeah,
we'll get started with the basics, right, of content
yeah,
marketing. So for people watching, I'm going to read out a paragraph from Google. I just searched content marketing, and then I'll set that as a foundation, and we can go from there, right? So
yeah,
when I'm reading it, it says content marketing is a marketing strategy used to attract, engage, and retain an audience by creating and sharing relevant articles, videos, podcasts, and other media. This is from MailChimp.com. So that's what I'm reading. But in your words, as somebody who's in the business of content marketing, can you help us understand what it is?
yeah. Content marketing is a marketing approach that companies or certain projects use to create and distribute a stack of content to attract and retain a specific audience. So when I say a stack of content, I mean uh, it can be any type of content, right? It can be a blog post, it can be social media, it can be case studies, email, ebooks, etc. So content has always been there and it's everywhere. So if you think about it, around 40 years ago, the content was on magazines, on flyers, on newspapers, and that's the way we used to consume content. And now those context tags are multiplied, and every year they multiply, and you can find content absolutely everywhere, and we consume it in different channels, in different ways. So, for example, some people prefer to consume content by email, other by social media, other by blog. So, content basically is everywhere. Is a way to communicate the value to a specific audience, and yeah, well, that's basically how I will define it. And I think that is a very important basis to understand, because I think that's the North Star for example, for me, that I'm a content marketer, and understand that the most important thing is to create something of value that you will uh, communicate through a specific stack of content, and that you must have a specific audience that you want to reach out.
Perfect, right? So you said a number of things there. We're going to dig deeper into each of those items. The first
Yeah,
thing you said was content and content marketing has been around for several years. It has changed shapes and
yeah,
forms today, right? That's one of the things you mentioned.
yeah,
So in terms of, let's start with the challenges, right? But there's various aspects to it. What is, if you have to call out for one or two main differences between how content marketing may have been a few years ago compared to where it is today, and where you actually see it in the next several years? Like if you have to just draw it, bucket that into three different categories: how it was
yeah.
in the recent past, how you actually see it today, and where you see it go tomorrow. What would you say for that?
So, specifically on my field that I work in tech, and I have been working for tech startups for the past 3 years, and I worked before on my own startup for 4 years. Before, you had a few content stacks to choose, and it was really difficult to measure the impact that it had. So, for example, before, if you wanted to share an ad, you had to do it through newspaper or through this. We're talking about 40, 50 years ago. So you had to do it through a magazine, newspaper, and it was really difficult to define what's the impact. In big companies used to invest a lot of money in people. Companies still do it. We still invest a lot of money in ads, but before, it was really difficult to measure the impact. nowadays we have a lot of resources to understand if what we're sharing is actually converting. When I say convert, is having a specific goal that we want to achieve. For example, we want people to click, we want people to open it, we want people to create a project. So it's easier to understand that. But at the same time, is really, we have so many options, so many channels, so many content stacks that how do you how do you choose which channel do you use, what type of content will you go for? And when you are in a bigger company with a lot of resources, you can invest in research and to understand what content you should use and which channel you should use and what type of ads you can give it a try and see if it is working or not. But for small startups, it is not that easy to understand what can be better for your startup. Where is your audience? What content should I get started? I think that's the challenges for smaller startups like the ones that I'm working today. And actually, the ones that I have been working in the past years are not even that like that small. There is some experience, but when a startup is in the very early stage, the question is how do I get started? Which channel should I choose? And what type of content will be the best to get started? I think that is one of the challenges that I will say that yeah, companies can face, small startups can face today.
Oh, you said some brilliant points there. Do you mind repeating the last? I was just jotting down notes as you go. I didn't capture the last. You mentioned 3 points there, right? The distribution channels, like how you're going to distribute your content is one
Yeah,
item. That let's talk
yeah,
about that. The next one of, I mean, in no particular order, but the other item is you mentioned the type of content. What
yeah,
content should I actually be creating? There's many different types of content. Who I should be creating it for? And then the third I also want to add into the mix, Desi, was where the where the consumption happens from geographically, right? Let's say
yeah,
I want to get into each of these aspects in a bit more detail, right? But you
yeah,
set the foundation brilliantly there. And you also mentioned the challenges between a larger organization that has the funds, the
yeah,
money to invest research, do trial and error, maybe more A/B testing, compared to
yeah,
smaller organizations and startups that may or may not be able to afford those. So let's get
yeah.
into each of these items because they're
Okay.
all super interesting, both from a personal and professional standpoint to me and to the
Yeah,
audience who's actually watching this content, right? So
yeah.
the first thing, the type of content. Now let's start there. Now this is a broad topic, but you mentioned tech startups, and we are a tech startup, so we can start
Mhm.
there and sort of work our way outside of that. How do we figure out the type of content before we start distributing it?
So I will start actually before defining the type of content, I will say, what are you going to share? What is the content that you will create? And here, this is very, very important to define from the very beginning. And and here is where I have seen a few companies, a few small early stage startups, or yeah, a person that creates an open source project where they fail. They when you starting the first point is actually defining what are you going to share. And what I will suggest to people is to give as so you will communicate to people that has no idea what are you doing, what your company, what your startup is doing. So you have to communicate the basics. What and answer the basic questions. What, why, eh, who, and how. So, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? For who are you, like, who are you, who's the project for, and how it works? Sometimes you go to a GitHub repo to the README, and they have it looks like a great project, but it's not completely clear. What
Hmm.
is it? Like, who will take the most advantage of this project? And how it exactly works. And I think assuming that you have a great project and just putting it out there with the basic information, it still will grow because it is a great project, is a big mistake. You have to
Wow.
answer the basics.
You said it, you said it in the best possible way, right? I'll go back to one of the conversations I had with a different guest not too long ago in the context of sales. And here's what I mentioned there. And I want to, what you mentioned, told here resonates very well. And I want to add something more to it. Uh, we believe sometimes that you create a brilliant product, right? That the
Mm-hmm.
world really needs it. Nobody else has created this product ever. And even if somebody did, you happen to have the best version of such a product that's available out there, right? There's sometimes you're not contrived in that thinking, meaning you sometimes genuinely believe this. And then you think, you know what, let me create this, not do anything more about it. People are
Mm,
going to find it because, of course, they're going to find it because I created this wonderful product.
yeah,
Nobody else has anything better. It doesn't even come close. Why would they not possibly find it? If the answer to the question was sure they will find it, then we would have no such thing as sales in this world,
yeah,
correct? And
yeah,
having been doing that for the last couple of months, I've realized how hard sales is. It's one of the hardest things ever.
yeah,
I'd never thought it was easy, but I had no idea it was going to be this hard. For instance, creating something to
yeah,
me as an engineer seems like it's a whole lot easier, personally speaking, than actually taking it and making people understand. So I want to come back to what you just said, saying you took GitHub projects, you took a README, right? And that's
yeah,
like, you're going at the repository level. But before we go to that, I just want to go like 30,000 foot, right? You created something. You mentioned the what, the why, the who, and the how. Let's talk about
yeah,
that. Okay, what we created as a founder, as a co-founder, as a small group of people, we it's very clear to us. This is what I want to. This is what I created,
yeah.
and why is it not obvious to somebody else looking at it? How do you go about, I know this is a general question, Desi, but if we can take specifics or not even take specifics, how do you answer the what? Because in your mind it's so clear.
Yeah.
Do you go to different people and try to sort of explore your idea? How do you recommend that we do this?
So I think something very common when you start a business is that you want to resolve so many issues because you really believe in your product or your project, and you say, okay, I want people to have in mind, like, to be clear that you can do this and that and that and that and that with my project. So when they answer the what is your product, the answer becomes very broad. And then when you go and you read the what, it's it's a tool to do, and then a word that is very broad. And then, okay, it's a tool that do this, but that doesn't says a lot. And the reason why people do this is because, yeah, your product can actually answer a lot of needs, but it tells me that you are still not clear about many things, like audience and one specific use case where you can actually get started. And that's normal because you're getting started on when you get started, that's very common. So I think when you answer the what, the best thing to get started at the very beginning is being very specific about the main issue your product is solving. And I think that's the most important thing. You don't have to give a broad thing about the many things your product can solve, but the one thing, the most important thing, the problem that you were actually solving when you decided to create that project or that product.
Perfect, right? So let me say then, which means the what, the why, the who, and the how. The more you speak about this, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the order of these things matters. Not only do those matter independently, so because you mentioned pain points, right? What is the issue
Yeah.
that you're solving? Which means the why. Should we then start with the why before the what, or does it not matter?
Mm, I think the most important thing is that you communicate everything. I think if in the storytelling of your, like when you are going to communicate all that stuff, you could get started. The why, what was the problem that first came up, and then how, like what was the answer that came after it. And it will depend on how you want to structure that, but what you're telling me is having a very specific storytelling on how do you tell this story of your product. And that's great, because in the end you have to communicate it. And I think the most important thing is that you are clear and kind of direct on, straightforward on what do you do, why you are doing it, for who is it, and how people can actually use what you are like giving to the world in your project or your product.
Lovely, right? So you mentioned storytelling a couple of times. Let's talk about that because I had a conversation with a different podcaster. He mentioned storytelling in the context of an example that I brought to the table. I had mentioned, Taylor Swift is probably the world's most popular
Yeah.
musician or singer. She's brilliantly talented, obviously, but it cannot, I don't, in my mind I'm wondering, is it just talent or is it a lot more than talent? Because there are a lot of talented people, but not everybody is nearly as popular. Not,
Yeah.
they don't sell out in every part of the world and every seat that's available in a stadium, no matter how big that auditorium or the stadium is. He mentioned that one of the things he thought was the storytelling was an important aspect of why, one of the reasons why Taylor is such a popular musician and composer.
Yeah.
So storytelling is very, very crucial and important. And you mentioned storytelling. Let's and then I want to tie that to content marketing because
Yeah.
storytelling is very complex. It needs a
Yeah.
lot of talent. I want to ask you how to approach it, but before I go there, so the why. So let's say we determine the why. I say, hey, Desi, here are some of the pain points that you might have. Let's pretend that I'm creating a solution to help you as a content marketer. I now have
Mm-hmm.
to understand what pain points a traditional content marketer might have, and
Mm-hmm.
I come meet up with you and say, hey, Desi, you're a content marketer. I've talked to other content marketers, and these are some of the issues that they have. And here is the solution that we've created to address it. So, the why is basically your pain points as a content marketer. The what happens to be the solution that I've, say, created to solving those
Mm-hmm.
problems. Now, what other questions remain? The who and the how. Let's talk about both of them. Uh, let's start with the who.
Mm-hmm.
How do I determine who I should be? Because there are a lot of content marketers, possibly,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a lot of engineers. What I mean by that is there's more than one person in that business, and I'm a small company. I want to reach every content marketer that's out there in the entire whole wide world, but that's not possible, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So, how do I go about the who?
I think, as you said, you said something very important when we talk about, okay, who I want to reach, and you said, okay, all the content marketers that are out there in the whole world, and that is very a common mistake we make. I have made it, and I think we all have made it in the past, and it's it's really hard sometimes to define the audience, because you really have to, I have first you have to define everything, have everything very clear, but at the same time every product is always evolving, and when it evolves, your audience can evolve as well. So on asking, okay, how do I define the who, is a question you have to constantly make. And when we talk about content marketing, uh, I personally think that every piece of content has to have a specific audience, and it's a question that I have to answer myself for every piece of content. But it will depend on who is the target audience and the personas of your business, right? So, and who are the personas will depend on what's the problem you're solving. And you say, okay, for content marketers all around the world. Okay, you cannot reach the whole world. You think this is you're giving a solution to content marketers, but if you try to reach the whole world, you will probably not, like, burn out trying to, like, do so many things trying to reach everyone. So you have to narrow it to an if the problem that you're solving is because you had a specific need and there is where the inspiration is coming, who are you in your profile can define a persona, and with that you can define the audience, and you can get started by in a specific people, like specific location, a specific profile, students that are is getting started in content marketing. So I will start with that specific audience, and then you can then start going to a more wide audience. But the most important is that you begin at a specific point with a specific information, not going for everyone, because you will end up doing a lot and not doing anything at the
Anything
same
at
time.
all. This is very, very technical. What you just mentioned, I want everybody, I personally will watch this and pause your answers because your answers are very technical, right? And it might, for me, I would need 2 listens or 5 listens before I understand the premise behind what you're saying, because it is very technical. What you mentioned there is very interesting. You have to start small, sure, right? We have to start
Yeah,
somewhere. We have to start small. In the greed to reach the entire world, we may we may end up reaching nobody, right? Nobody. That's the
mm-hmm.
big risk that you take with intending, and that's a very it sounds simple when it's being said, but I can tell you,
Yeah,
even from through personal slash professional experience, it's not. Because even though in your mind I have clarity, I'm like, hey, what Desi is saying here makes complete sense. I couldn't agree with that anymore, and I try to put that into practice
yeah,
after I come to that agreement in my own mind. But when I execute it, even though it's clear in
mm-hmm.
my mind, the execution actually is not in sync with what is in my
Yeah,
mind. And
yeah,
the problem is, I don't even know for a fair bit of time, that the execution is it is detached from what I intended it to do, right? So the couple of
yeah,
challenges I want to ask you is, okay, I decided I want to reach content marketers.
mm-hmm.
I want to start with a small group of people. You mentioned students, for instance. I
Mm-hmm.
come up with a demographic, right? And then
Yeah.
how about a region? When you say the group of people, should I be saying, hey, I want to reach content marketers who are maybe students who are located in the east coast of the US or near Washington D.C., where I live? How specific does that need to be? Like, what are some of the factors that I have to include in that?
I think that's a very tricky question, because when you're getting started, it will depend on the content, and not just the content, but actually your business and your product. And sometimes it will be very important for you to define that, because, for example, if your business is an online store, you do have to define that kind of stuff. But if you are building a product that, I don't know, it's a CMS, then it doesn't necessarily has to be so specific in the demographics. Like, you can say, okay, I will get started in the US, and for example, if you're doing ads, it's important for you to define that. But the truth is that uh, um, a founder in the early stage of a startup doesn't get started with ads. It shouldn't, actually. The organic, an organic. Well, you can do it, but actually, it's better to do it organically, and A/B test, like what actually works, what doesn't, before investing money in ads, right? You have to have things a little bit more clear, right? So, I can give you an example. So, okay, you are getting started with a technical product, right? That is targeting developers, and you say, okay, this product is perfect for developers, right? It will solve everything for them, right? Because that's the way sometimes we think when
Right.
we start, right? And then yeah, when we say, yeah, it's for developers, it's very broad. Like, what type of developers, what type of use cases is most likely to solve developers that work in this specific industry or in other industries? So, okay, I think this specific industry will be perfect, healthcare. And okay, now what type of developers? Okay, front end developers, or the back end developers, or DevOps. And I think, which is many times, it's not always the case, but many times the case is that the engineers that start a product is because they had the need of the product and they didn't find a solution, or the solutions that were out there were very pricey, or they wanted to do it like they did it like customized, like they built it from scratch, but now they want to open source it, right? So sometimes what I told you, oh, it's a great product, all the developers will want to use it, right? But no, I mean, it could be true, but you need to communicate what it is, what we already talked about, what it is, what's the purpose, why is it for, but the who, okay, but who is going to take more advantage of this product? And you can get started by, who are you? Okay, you're a developer that were a freelancer that works mostly with backend solutions and so on, right? So those specifics, answering very specific questions, you
These
can
are
get
these
started.
are amazing questions, and I think what I want to tell people is, if you're overwhelmed just listening to those questions, I think it's fine, because you rather be overwhelmed than be ignorant, is at least my 2 cents.
Yeah,
Because not knowing that there are these questions and trivializing a lot of these is actually a recipe for disaster, if you will.
yeah,
So it's sometimes all right to feel overwhelmed, but then you jot all of these points down and then go step by step. Start really small. Let's say, for instance, let me take a random example. I'm vegetarian, like borderline vegan, and I love hummus. Right, it's one of my favorite things I eat all the time. Now, let's
yeah.
say I was starting to make hummus and sell it. Uh, I'm taking food as an example because other than eating it, I don't know much more about it, unfortunately. But I think it's a fine example to take because it's very different from the business I'm in. uh,
Mm-hmm.
there are certain in other words, if I want to sell online, since it's a perishable item, I can only sell to people who probably located reasonably nearby. I don't know, but you
Yeah,
know what I mean. It doesn't stay till the end of till eternity. So there
yeah,
are those limitations, and you try to define and narrow your market down because of those limitations when you're selling perishable food. Unfortunately or fortunately, when it comes to software, there's not that sense of perishability, which means I could
yeah,
make something that could theoretically and even pragmatically help people
yeah,
in the US, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and Southeast Asia, down under, everywhere in the world. And it could be a true statement that this problem is reasonably generic and the solution is very generic as well. So I could sell it to everybody. But that does not mean you should, because you're never going to be able to do justice by trying to have a market that's that broad.
yeah,
But Desi, here is the challenge. The problem seems generic enough. We are convinced it's a generic problem. The solution also seems generic enough. We are like, hey, you know what? Everybody can use this. And that might
mm-hmm.
even be true.
Mm-hmm.
How do I, if I told you those two things, I tell you that the problem is generic, and I tell you that the solution is reasonably generic, yet as a founder, how do I try to keep my focus small enough so I don't try to sell it to this entire world on day one or day two?
So I think when focusing in the topic of today, content marketing, I think when you define your audience, when it's very specific, okay, let's say where my product is going to target DevOps working in this specific industry, in small companies, because they don't have the budget to pay for a very pricey a solution that already exists, but it's very pricey, right? So your content will be around that. That is what you will create. You will, let's say, guides and tutorials around that. And then the products are always evolving. So you're constantly releasing new features and fixing specific things. And like the product is evolving, the roadmap of your product will be around that, will be around the needs of your specific audience. So and when we talk about the content marketing, when I say your content will be around that, okay, let's say you create some tutorials to show how you can use this product. The use case will be around your audience, because you know that audience, you know that these are the needs that they have. So that is what you will show in your tutorials, in your guides, and that is and then we can be more even like broad and specific. Your messaging will be around that as well, and the way you communicate to people, the tone of voice and everything will be to that audience. So uh, coming back to content marketing, and here I will jump to something that we were discussing about distribution. So okay, you already narrowed an audience, which let's uh, let's say the things like honestly can change eventually. You can say, okay, I screwed up, then I noticed that these other people were the ones that were using it the most. But let's say that at the first try you were right, this was the audience. Then you start creating content, and then you start distributing content. You say, okay, these people, I mean, I think they are in Twitter. I
Hey,
have
Desi.
talked to, yeah.
So, sorry to interrupt, but I want to do what I want to do is I want that to be a teaser for I'm going to this podcast is going to be in
Oh
a
yeah.
series. So the
Okay.
distribution, I want folks to come back and listen, watch
Okay.
the distribution. So what I will do
Okay.
is I'll pause, I'll summarize what we've discussed so far, and
Okay.
I'm
Yeah.
going to pause because distribution is a broad topic, and I want
Yeah.
to hit record after, as the second item in our series here, right? So
Okay.
if that's
Yeah.
all right with you, so what I will
Yeah.
do is, so folks, just to recap, we are talking to Desi Ugarte, who is a digital marketer. I've learned plenty in the last 30 minutes, and I have a lot more questions, right? I'm trying to jot down as we go, so excuse me if you hear the sound of the keyboard of me typing. Uh, but just to do a quick recap, we talked about the what, the why, and the who. We've not gone into the how, I think, at this point, but at least we've talked to some extent about the what, the why, and the who. We've taken a few different examples, right? We've focused to a large extent on tech startups, but I think the ideas and the thoughts that you're sharing, Desi, are beyond tech startups in my mind, right? They are You took the
Hmm.
examples of tech startups given both of our experiences, but I think
Yeah.
the idea itself is reasonably generic. It's applicable to other items that you could potentially be selling. In the next, the see, podcast, two of n, as I call it n, because sometimes it's hard to come with a finite number of podcasts before you get to the bottom of what you're trying to get to. So I used to say one of four, two of four, and then the four became six, for instance. Now I just generically say one of n. So folks, this is one of n in the series with Desi. In the second one, we will actually kick off the podcast talking about distribution. With that said, Desi, I want to end this one. Do you want to any closing thoughts with just the conversation we've had so far in this podcast?
I think what you just the way you summarize it is exactly it, right? If you're getting started with a project, or as we are talking right now, because of our background in tech and a small startup, tech startup, open source project, whatever you're starting, the most important, the a starting point regarding, yeah, it's a bit broader than content marketing, but it's the content you're creating, right? Give your audience at the moment where you're starting, give the people that you want to reach, your target audience, the basics. What are you doing? Why? For who are the people that can use that product, and how they can use it. Get started simple on a readme on a GitHub repo, or if you have the resources to get started on a website, perfect, because eventually, yes, you will have to have a website. But if you're getting started small, a GitHub repo, that's okay. Answer those questions. and that's a good point to get started.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Desi. We will continue this conversation, but this was awesome. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you. Thank you for the invite.